We are now prepared to destroy more rapidly and completely every productive enterprise the Japanese have in any city. We shall destroy their docks, their factories, and their communications.
1,000 miles away at Hiroshima and then again at Nagasaki came the world-shaking explosions of the atomic bomb.
Good evening and welcome back to Price of Power. Tonight we're going back to a moment near the middle of the 20th century that reshaped the course of world history. The atomic bombing of Hiroshima on the 6th of August, 1945. It is a story of science, war, and political calculation, but also of the ordinary people who lived in a particular city on a particular morning. The world they woke up to and the one they found themselves in an hour later were separated by a single act that had no precedent in human experience. Get comfortable, close your eyes if you like, and let the story carry you forward. To understand what happened in Hiroshima on that August morning, it helps to begin with the city itself rather than the bomb. Hiroshima sits on a broad, flat river delta in the southwestern corner of Honshu, Japan's largest island, where the Otter River divides into 6 separate channels before reaching Hiroshima Bay. The name in Japanese means broad island, a fitting description for a city built almost entirely at sea level on low alluvial ground. To the northwest and northeast, hills rise several hundred feet, but within the city itself, the land is open and essentially unbroken. That geographical flatness would prove significant. With no major terrain features to interrupt a blast wave, the bomb detonated above Hiroshima in 1945 would travel outward in nearly every direction without obstruction. Hiroshima was founded in the late 16th century as a castle town by the feudal lord Moriterumoto, who valued its position on the inland sea trade routes. Over the following centuries, the city grew steadily, and by the early 20th century, it had become one of Japan's larger urban centers, with tram lines, department stores, a university, and the dense commercial districts typical of modern Japanese cities. From 1868 onward, Hiroshima was also a major military center. It housed significant Japanese army headquarters, and during the First Sino-Japanese War in the 1890s, it briefly served as the site of the imperial headquarters itself. Soldiers had been departing from its port at Ujina for overseas postings for generations, and the presence of the military was woven into the city's economy and daily life. By the early 1940s, at the height of the Second World War, Hiroshima had reached a population of more than 380,000 people. As the Allied bombing campaign against Japanese cities intensified across the Pacific, the government began systematically evacuating civilians, children especially, to the countryside. By the summer of 1945, the city's registered population had declined to somewhere between 340,000 and 350,000, though military personnel stationed there added to that number considerably. What is notable about Hiroshima in the months before the bombing is something that struck the residents themselves. The city had been largely spared from the firebombing raids that were destroying city after city across Japan. Some residents speculated that Hiroshima had relatives in Hawaii and California who had petitioned the American government. Others thought the city might be reserved for occupation headquarters. The more practical-minded city government had been tearing down buildings along designated firebreak corridors since 1944. Whatever the reasoning residents invented, the fact of Hiroshima's relative preservation was real, and it was intentional, though not for any of the reasons they imagined. American military planners had deliberately withheld Hiroshima from the conventional bombing campaign. The city had been placed on a restricted list of targets, kept intact, so that the damage caused by the atomic bomb could be assessed without contamination from prior raids. To understand how that bomb came to exist, the story moves back several more years, to the summer of 1939 and a meeting on Long Island, New York. A Hungarian-born physicist named Leo Szilard had been growing alarmed by reports from Germany suggesting that Nazi scientists might be pursuing a weapon based on nuclear fission, one that could release energy orders of magnitude greater than any conventional explosive. Szilard recognized the physics and understood what such a weapon could mean. He needed to reach the American government, and he understood that the one name that might carry sufficient weight with a president was Albert Einstein. Szilard and a colleague drove to Einstein's summer home on Long Island. Einstein had left Germany in 1933 and had no illusions about the Nazi regime. He agreed to sign a letter addressed to President Franklin Roosevelt, warning that uranium could potentially be used to produce a new class of bomb of enormous destructive power, and urging the United States to investigate the possibility before Germany did. Roosevelt formed a small advisory committee, then another. Progress was gradual through 1940 and 1941. Then, on December 7, 1941, Japan attacked Pearl Harbor. The United States entered the war on both the Pacific and European fronts, and the pace of the nuclear program accelerated sharply. In the summer of 1942, the atomic bomb project was formally organized under the United States Army Corps of Engineers and given the administrative title of the Manhattan Engineer District, known to history as the Manhattan Project. By the time the project reached its operational peak, it employed more than 130,000 people across more than 30 sites in the United States, the United Kingdom, and Canada, and had cost approximately $2 billion, equivalent to roughly $37 billion in current terms. It was, by most measures, the largest coordinated scientific and industrial undertaking in history to that point. The project's scientific center was at Los Alamos, New Mexico, a remote facility established on the grounds of a former boys' school surrounded by pine forest and desert, accessible by a single road not marked on public maps. Here, under the direction of J. Robert Oppenheimer, a group of physicists worked to translate nuclear theory into a functional weapon. Many of them were refugees from Europe who had fled fascist regimes in Germany, Italy, and Hungary, motivated in part by the fear that Germany might reach a nuclear weapon first. 3 separate industrial facilities supported the work at Los Alamos. At Oak Ridge, Tennessee, massive plants worked around the clock to enrich uranium-235 to the concentration required for a sustained chain reaction. At Hanford, Washington, reactors converted uranium into plutonium-239, a second fissile material that became the basis for an alternative bomb design. At Los Alamos, Oppenheimer's team worked on the bomb mechanisms themselves. 2 weapon designs were developed in parallel. The first was a uranium gun-type device in which one subcritical mass of uranium-235 was fired down a cylinder into a second mass, creating a supercritical assembly and triggering a chain reaction. This design was mechanically straightforward, and its builders were confident enough in the underlying physics to use it without a prior test. It was called Little Boy. The second was a plutonium implosion device, a hollow sphere of plutonium surrounded by precisely shaped explosive lenses that, when detonated simultaneously, compressed the core to a critical mass. This design was more complex and required testing. It was called Fat Man. On July 16, 1945, in the pre-dawn hours at the Trinity test site near Alamogordo, New Mexico, the world's first nuclear device was detonated. The explosion released energy equivalent to roughly 21,000 tons of TNT. The light was described by witnesses as brighter than several suns. The shockwave was felt 160 miles away. A column of fire and smoke rose into the atmosphere in the now familiar mushroom shape. Oppenheimer, observing from a bunker several miles away, later recalled a line from the Bhagavad Gita passing through his mind. "I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." The plutonium implosion device had worked. The uranium gun-type bomb was considered sufficiently reliable to use without a test. By the summer of 1945, the Pacific War had been grinding forward for nearly 4 years. Japan had been in continuous military conflict since its invasion of Manchuria in 1931. By 1945, the country's merchant fleet had been effectively destroyed, its cities were under sustained conventional bombing attack, and its ability to sustain the war economically was collapsing. 64 Japanese cities had been damaged or destroyed in American firebombing campaigns. A single raid on Tokyo in March 1945 had killed more than 80,000 people in one night. Yet the Japanese military government gave no indication of accepting the Allied demand for unconditional surrender. For many within the military hierarchy, the code of Bushido and the national ideology surrounding the emperor made surrender a less acceptable outcome than mass casualties. American military planners studying the projected costs of a mainland invasion concluded that the numbers would be very large. Operation Downfall, the plan for invading Japan, called for 2 massive amphibious assaults, a landing on Kyushu in November 1945 and a second on Honshu in the spring of 1946. Military estimates of American casualties in such an operation ranged from hundreds of thousands to over 1 million, with potentially greater Japanese losses. The Battle of Okinawa, which ended in late June 1945, had given both sides a recent and vivid illustration of what fighting on Japanese soil would involve. Okinawa cost approximately 12,000 American dead, roughly 100,000 Japanese military dead, and between 42,000 and 150,000 Okinawan civilian deaths. President Harry Truman, who had come to office following Franklin Roosevelt's death in April 1945 with no prior knowledge of the Manhattan Project, was briefed on it and eventually authorized its use against Japan. In late July, the Allied leaders meeting at Potsdam issued a declaration demanding Japan's unconditional surrender and warning of prompt and utter destruction if the demand was ignored. Japan's government did not respond with acceptance. The preparations continued. On July 26, 1945, the heavy cruiser USS Indianapolis delivered the core components of Little Boy to Tinian Island in the Marianas, approximately 2,000 miles south of Japan, roughly 6 hours of flight time for a B-29 bomber. The island's north field had been built out with enormous runways capable of supporting the heaviest bombers in the American inventory. The unit assigned to carry out the mission was the 509th Composite Group, a specially formed force of approximately 1,800 men that had been assembled and trained in secrecy at Wendover Army Air Base in Utah's Salt Flats since late 1944. Most of the unit's personnel had been told nothing about the nature of their mission. Their commanding officer, Colonel Paul W. Tibbets, Jr., had been informed of the full scope of the assignment when he was appointed to lead the group in September 1944. From that point, his work for the next 10 months was directed toward a single operation. Tibbets was 30 years old in the summer of 1945 and among the most experienced B-29 pilots in the American Air Force, with prior combat service in both Europe and North Africa. He had been selected for his combination of technical skill, record of precision, and capacity to manage the weight of an assignment of this magnitude. On the evening of August 5th, on Tinian, he had a maintenance man paint a name in block letters on the nose of his assigned aircraft. Enola Gay, his mother's name. Little Boy had been assembled, inspected, and loaded into the aircraft's modified bomb bay. The weapon was just over 10 feet long, slightly less than 2.5 feet in diameter, and weighed approximately 4.4 tons. It contained about 64 kilograms of enriched uranium-235, the near entirety of the American weapons-grade supply at that time. The bomb had never been tested. No gun-type uranium device had ever been detonated. The physicists and engineers were confident in the design, but it was untested confidence. For safety reasons, the weapon would be armed in flight rather than on the ground. Navy Captain William Parsons, the bomb's weaponeer and one of its principal designers, spent the evening before the mission practicing the arming procedure in the dark by feel alone, climbing in and out of the bomb bay until he was certain he could complete it reliably at altitude. At 2:45 in the morning on August 6, 1945, the Enola Gay lifted off from North Field on Tinian. The crew of 12 included Tibbets at the controls, co-pilot Captain Robert Lewis, Navigator Captain Theodore Van Kirk, Bombardier Major Thomas Ferraby, and the weaponeer Parsons. 2 accompanying aircraft flew nearby, one carrying scientific instruments, the other carrying cameras and observers. 3 weather reconnaissance planes had already departed ahead of the formation to assess conditions over the potential target cities. During the 6-hour flight north toward Japan, the crew ate and rested. Parsons went to work, arming the bomb in the bay below, inserting the propellant charge that would fire the uranium projectile down the weapon's barrel. By shortly after 6 in the morning, as light began to appear on the Pacific horizon, Little Boy was fully armed. Tibbets announced over the intercom that the aircraft was carrying the world's first atomic bomb. The weather report from the reconnaissance plane over Hiroshima indicated clear skies. Hiroshima remained the primary target. In Hiroshima that same morning, the 6th of August, was a Monday, warm and clear, and the city had begun its day in the usual way. Air raid sirens had sounded at 7:09 when Japanese radar detected the weather reconnaissance planes moving toward the city. People had taken shelter. Trams stopped. Then the all-clear came, and the city resumed its routines. By 8 o'clock, the streets were full again. Approximately 40,000 military personnel were stationed in or around Hiroshima that day, but the vast majority of the city's roughly 350,000 residents were civilians, office workers, shopkeepers, teachers, factory employees, students, and children. Many of those children had been evacuated to the countryside earlier in the war, but by the summer of 1945, teenagers had been brought back in large numbers not to attend school, but to work. Japan's labor force had been depleted by years of war, and boys and girls as young as 12 and 13 had been drafted into various wartime duties. Some worked in the postal system or as tram conductors, others were assigned to demolition work along firebreak corridors, tearing down buildings to create cleared lanes that the military hoped would limit fire damage in a conventional bombing attack. Research conducted decades later by Professor Keiko Otani determined that within 1 kilometer of where the bomb would detonate, more than 8,000 students and young workers were present on the morning of August 6th. Of those in the innermost zone, roughly 60% would die. At 7:25, the Enola Gay was at 31,600 feet. At 8 o'clock, Japanese radar again detected aircraft approaching, and radio stations broadcast a second warning. Many residents of Hiroshima had by that point grown accustomed to high-altitude B-29s crossing the sky without attacking. The silver aircraft were visible in the morning light, and the city had been spared for so long that the warnings had begun to feel routine. People looked up and went back to what they were doing. In the Enola Gay, bombardier Tom Ferriby was at his Norden bomb site as the distinctive delta shape of Hiroshima came into view below. He was looking for the T-shaped Aioi Bridge, where 2 channels of the Ota River converged, a landmark unmistakable from altitude and easily locked onto by the bomb site's optics. At 8:14 and 17 seconds, Ferriby confirmed he had the aiming point. The navigator verified it. The crew put on dark protective goggles. A tone signal went to the instrument aircraft following behind. 2 minor corrections were made to the heading. At 8:15 on the morning of August 6, 1945, the bomb bay doors of the Enola Gay opened and little boy fell away into clear air above Hiroshima. The aircraft, relieved of 9,700 pounds, lurched upward. Tibbets immediately executed a tight 155-degree turn and pushed the engines hard to maximize the distance between the aircraft and the detonation point. The bomb fell for 43 seconds and detonated approximately 600 meters above the city, almost directly over Shima Hospital, slightly off the intended aiming point of the Aioi Bridge. It was designed to explode in the air rather than on impact, to maximize the lateral radius of the blast. The detonation released energy equivalent to approximately 15,000 tons of TNT in a single millisecond. The first effect was a flash of gamma radiation traveling at the speed of light, preceding any sound or pressure wave. Within roughly 500 meters of the hypocenter, that radiation dose was lethal. It passed through walls and through bodies. People in the innermost zone died before any pain signal could travel through their nervous systems. Behind the radiation came the thermal pulse, a fireball of superheated air expanding outward from the detonation point. At its center, temperatures reached approximately 6,000 degrees Celsius, comparable to the surface of the sun. Within a certain radius, stone, metal, wood, and human beings were vaporized. Beyond that radius, the heat destroyed exposed skin to its deepest layers. It was a warm summer morning, and many people were lightly dressed. Large areas of unprotected skin received the full thermal dose. The burns produced had no precedent in prior medical experience. They penetrated far below the surface, destroying nerve tissue and leaving raw flesh directly exposed to the air. Those who survived the first moments and retained the capacity to feel pain described a degree of suffering that no existing medical language had been developed to convey. Within seconds of the thermal pulse, a shock wave expanding at speeds approaching 1,000 miles per hour moved through the city. It demolished roughly 70% of Hiroshima's buildings. Wooden structures, which constituted the majority of the city's built environment, were smashed or swept away outright. Reinforced concrete buildings lost their windows, interiors, and contents. A single hill in the eastern part of the city deflected the shockwaves slightly over a narrow area, but otherwise the destruction across the flat delta was close to uniform. Fires ignited across the city almost simultaneously in the seconds following the thermal pulse, fed by broken gas lines, overturned stoves, and the dry timber of demolished buildings. Within hours, the individual fires merged into a single urban firestorm, consuming more than 4.5 square miles. The heat generated its own inward wind system, drawing air toward the center of the blaze. The firestorm burned through the day. Above the city, the mushroom cloud rose to more than 7 miles. The crew of the Enola, completing their turn away from Hiroshima, looked back. Co-pilot Robert Lewis wrote in his mission log, "My God, what have we done?" At the moment of detonation, an estimated 70,000 to 80,000 people were killed outright. In the following minutes and hours, thousands more died from burns, blast injuries, and the combined effects of structural collapse and fire. By the end of 1945, accounting for deaths from radiation sickness and the delayed consequences of injury, the total confirmed dead in Hiroshima reached somewhere between 90,000 and 140,000 people. The range reflects, in part, the destruction of the city's own record-keeping infrastructure in the blast. Fewer than 10% of the dead were military personnel. The remainder were civilians. For those who survived the initial blast, the hours that followed were characterized by physical conditions that survivors consistently described as beyond their ability to fully communicate. The streets had ceased to exist as streets. The landscape was rubble, ash, blocked passages, and fire in every direction, with the Ota River below choked with bodies and debris. The injured moved toward open space and water, away from the fires, in large numbers and in relative silence. Witnesses noted the silence repeatedly, the near absence of voices among thousands of people walking through extreme suffering. Their clothes had been blown off or burned away. Skin had separated from the underlying tissue on arms and hands and faces and hung loosely. People held their arms extended from their bodies, unable to tolerate contact. Survivors later described those walking figures as looking unlike anything they could categorize as human. Yoshito Matsushige was 32 years old, a photographer for the Chugoku Shimbun newspaper, living with his pregnant wife, less than 2 miles from the hypocenter. The shockwave partially destroyed their home, but they both survived. Matsushige recovered his camera from the debris, obtained clothing from a nearby military post, and went outside. He attempted to move toward the city center and could not get through. The fires were too dense, the streets completely blocked. He turned back and made his way to the Miyuki Bridge, a main crossing over the Ota River, approximately 1.5 miles from the hypocenter, still standing and passable, which had become a gathering point for the injured. What he found there, Matsushige stood looking at for 20 minutes before he pressed the shutter. Hundreds of people had made their way to the bridge, drawn by the open air and the relative distance from the fires consuming the city center. They sat or lay along the bridge and its approaches, many in serious condition. Civil defense workers had brought buckets of rapeseed oil and were applying it to burns as a rudimentary treatment measure. When the rapeseed oil ran out, they replaced it with engine oil taken from a nearby train depot. The people covered in it turned black. There were teenagers, children, old people, soldiers, and office workers. Many were alone. Some were calling out names. Matsushige took 2 photographs and put the camera away. He later wrote that the viewfinder had clouded over with his tears. He wrote that the eyes of the wounded seemed fixed on him, as if they needed someone to tell the world what was happening to them, and that he did not know whether photographing them was cruel or the most useful thing he could do. He could not decide. He took the photographs. Among those at the Miyuki Bridge that morning was a 13-year-old girl named Mitsuko Kuchi, who had been assigned to work at the Postal Savings Bank as part of the wartime labor mobilization. The shockwave reached the bank building at roughly 160 miles per hour. The structure survived, but all its windows exploded inward, and the flying glass left Mitsuko and her co-workers badly cut. 6 of the girls made their way to the bridge together. What Mitsuko Kuchi witnessed there, she kept largely to herself for the next 70 years. She remembered a woman holding a small, charred body, a dead child, calling the child's name and telling it to wake up. The child did not wake up. Mitsuko was 13 and unable to help. She thought of that woman and that child every day for the rest of her life. Also at the bridge was a 20-year-old student named Sunao Tsuboi, who had been on his way to class when the bomb detonated 3/4 of a mile above the city. The radiation had burned his face and his back was bleeding. He had seen things on the streets between his starting point and the bridge that he later described only in fragments. At the bridge, certain he was going to die, and worried that his identity papers had been destroyed and that his body would not be returned to his family, he picked up a stone and scratched a message into the bridge surface. "Tsuboi is dying here." He described it afterward as a very lonely feeling. He survived. He lived to an advanced age, bearing the visible scars of the 6th of August for the rest of his life. He later said of the Miyuki Bridge that it was not only where the injured had gathered, but where the rest of his life began. In the immediate aftermath, those still capable of movement searched for hospitals or for ground outside the fire zone. The destruction of Hiroshima's medical infrastructure had been near total. Of the city's 30 medical facilities, only 3 remained functional. Of approximately 300 doctors, more than 270 had been killed or seriously wounded. Of 1,780 nurses, 1,654 were dead or incapacitated. Tens of thousands of injured people lay in gardens, schoolyards, and rubble, waiting for care that in many cases never arrived. The fires burned for approximately 12 hours before the individual blazes began to diminish. Those who reached the rivers found the water carrying bodies and debris in such quantities that the rivers provided little relief. Some of the wounded, driven by the severe thirst that accompanies deep burns, threw themselves into the water in an attempt to cool their skin and drowned. In those first hours, neither the survivors in the city nor the Japanese military command understood precisely what had happened. No one knew initially that a single bomb had been responsible. The working assumption among Japanese military officials in the early hours was that perhaps hundreds of incendiary bombs had been dropped simultaneously. It would be several days before the nature of the weapon was publicly confirmed. 4 days after the bombing, a second catastrophe began to develop, this time from within the bodies of people who had survived the initial blast and burns. Survivors who had been beyond the range of immediately lethal radiation began presenting with nausea and vomiting, high fevers, diarrhea, bleeding from the gums and nose, purple discolorations of the skin, and severe hair loss. These were the symptoms of acute radiation sickness, the result of bone marrow and immune system damage caused by ionizing radiation from the detonation. The doctors and nurses who had survived the bombing had no established framework for understanding or treating what they were seeing. Some believed it might be contagious. For a period, relief workers entering the city were uncertain whether proximity to the ruins posed a risk of this unnamed illness. In the days following the bombing, dozens of women who had been pregnant at the time went into premature labor in the rubble of the still-burning city. Goro Takeuchi, a 22-year-old army cadet assigned to the relief effort, assisted in delivering several of these births. He later described the infants as white and still, not the normal color of healthy newborns. The dying did not end in August. Through September and into the autumn of 1945, people continued to die from radiation sickness and the long-term consequences of their injuries. Japanese government records compiled after the war recorded approximately 140,000 deaths in Hiroshima by the end of 1945. Some scholars have placed the true figure higher. The uncertainty in the number is in part a product of the same event it records. 3 days after Hiroshima, on August 9, 1945, a second American B-29, named Bockscar and carrying the plutonium bomb Fat Man, approached its primary target of Kokura on the Japanese island of Kyushu. Kokura was covered by cloud and smoke from conventional bombing the previous day. The crew made 3 passes and could not acquire a visual aiming point. Low on fuel, they diverted to the secondary target. Nagasaki. Fat Man detonated over Nagasaki at 11:02 in the morning, releasing energy equivalent to roughly 21,000 tons of TNT. Nagasaki's hilly geography confined the blast somewhat, limiting the total area of destruction compared to Hiroshima, but the immediate and short-term death toll was estimated at between 60,000 and 80,000 people, with tens of thousands more seriously injured. The combined death toll from both bombings, counting those who died in the months that followed from radiation sickness and related conditions, has been estimated at between 150,000 and 246,000. Both cities had large populations of Korean workers brought to Japan as forced labor during the colonial period. Approximately 1 in 7 of the Hiroshima victims was believed to be of Korean ancestry, deaths that went largely unrecorded and unacknowledged for decades. On August 15, 1945, 9 days after Hiroshima, Emperor Hirohito addressed the Japanese people in a radio broadcast, the first time most ordinary Japanese citizens had ever heard the emperor's voice. He announced, in the formal language of the imperial court, Japan's acceptance of Allied surrender terms. He cited the enemy's deployment of a new and most cruel bomb of unusual destructive power as among the factors that had led to the decision. The formal surrender documents were signed on September 2, 1945, aboard the American battleship Missouri in Tokyo Bay, in the presence of General Douglas MacArthur. The Second World War was over. The political and historical debates around the decision to use the atomic bomb began almost immediately and have continued without resolution. Those who have defended the decision have argued that it shortened the war and averted the enormous casualties projected for a mainland invasion on both the American and Japanese sides. Critics have argued that Japan was close to surrender before the bombs were dropped, that the weapons were not strictly necessary to end the war, and that other considerations, including demonstrating American nuclear capability to the Soviet Union, played a significant role in the decision. Historians have examined these questions for 8 decades. The debate has not been resolved and likely will not be. What is not in serious dispute is that the people who died in Hiroshima and Nagasaki were overwhelmingly civilians, and that the weapons used against them represented a development in warfare without precedent. In the immediate post-war period, the American occupation of Japan imposed significant controls on public information about the bombings. General Douglas MacArthur's occupation press code restricted Japanese journalists from reporting on the effects of the atomic weapons and imposed similar limits on foreign correspondents. A 32-man Japanese film crew had documented Hiroshima and Nagasaki in the weeks following the bombings. That footage was confiscated by American authorities in 1946, classified and withheld from public view for decades. Detailed casualty statistics were suppressed. The Atomic Bomb Casualty Commission, established by the American occupation government, undertook a long-term health study of bomb survivors. Doctors and researchers traveled to Hiroshima and Nagasaki, examined survivors, documented their conditions, and sent them home without treatment. The Commission's policy of observation without medical care was controversial from its inception and remained a source of bitterness among survivors for the rest of their lives. Survivors were, in effect, long-term research subjects. The data the Commission accumulated was classified. When General Leslie Groves, the military director of the Manhattan Project, was confronted with Japanese reports of deaths from radiation sickness in September 1945, he publicly characterized them as Japanese propaganda. In testimony before the United States Senate that November, he described radiation poisoning as a very pleasant way to die. That position was not sustainable against the mounting medical evidence, but it shaped the public narrative for a period. The survivors, the hibakusha, meaning explosion-affected people, faced compounded difficulties in the years after the bombing. Acute radiation sickness had killed many in the first weeks and months. Those who survived the acute phase faced elevated lifetime risks of several cancers. Within approximately 2 years of the bombings, leukemia rates began to rise noticeably among survivors. Within a decade, elevated rates of thyroid cancer, breast cancer, lung cancer, and other solid tumors were being documented in the exposed population. Long-term follow-up studies conducted by the Radiation Effects Research Foundation, the successor organization to the Atomic Bomb Casualty Commission, tracked tens of thousands of survivors across their entire lifetimes and produced data that substantially advanced the scientific understanding of radiation's effects on human health. Beyond the physical consequences, the hibakusha encountered social stigma. In the years following the war, persistent and unfounded fears circulated that radiation sickness might be contagious and that the hibakusha was somehow dangerous to associate with. There were widespread concerns that their children would be born with defects. Long-term studies have not confirmed these fears. No statistically demonstrable increase in birth defects or genetic abnormalities has been found in children conceived after the bombings by surviving parents. But that evidence accumulated slowly, and in the interim, the fears were real and their social effects were significant. Women known to be hibakusha found it difficult or impossible to marry. Men found their employment prospects reduced. Families concealed their exposure, lying to prospective employers and spouses, maintaining the silence that the occupation censorship had in many ways encouraged. One of the women photographed by Yoshito Matsushige at the Miyuki Bridge declined, decades later, to be identified when investigators located her. Not because she had forgotten what had happened, but because the weight of being publicly identified as a hibakusha was still too heavy to carry. Sunao Tsuboi, who had scratched his name into the bridge stones expecting to die at 20, lived to old age bearing the scarring from August 6th on his face for the rest of his life. He became an advocate for nuclear disarmament, speaking to audiences around the world about the Miyuki Bridge and what he had witnessed there. He said, in his later years, that after the last survivors died, there would be no one left to tell these stories. He considered it his obligation to remember everything. Among the survivors whose stories became widely known, one in particular has carried forward in the decades since with a specific kind of resonance. Sadako Sasaki was born on January 7, 1943, and was 2 years old when Little Boy detonated over Hiroshima. She and her mother were outside their home near Misasa Bridge, approximately 1,600 meters from the hypocenter, and were both knocked down by the shockwave. Both survived and appeared to do so without lasting injury. Sadako grew into a healthy, athletic child, notably fast on the track and well regarded in her school. In November 1954, when Sadako was 11, she began tiring easily. She became dizzy during a race. In January 1955, she was diagnosed with leukemia, the condition that researchers at the Hiroshima Radiation Effects Research Foundation had been tracking in bomb survivors for nearly a decade. She was admitted to the Red Cross Hospital in Hiroshima. There, her closest friend reminded her of a Japanese legend: "Fold 1,000 paper cranes and the gods might grant a wish." The crane carries traditional associations with longevity in Japanese culture. Sadako began folding, using medicine wrappers, scraps of paper, anything available, working between treatments and during rest periods. Sadako Sasaki died on October 25, 1955, 2 months before her 13th birthday. Her classmates raised funds and had a statue built in her memory in the Hiroshima Peace Memorial Park, a girl with outstretched arms, a folded crane rising above her. Children from around the world continue to send paper cranes to Hiroshima, where they are placed at the base of the monument in large garlands that are replaced throughout the year. The city of Hiroshima itself underwent a substantial reconstruction in the years after the war. Predictions made in the immediate aftermath that the city would be barren and uninhabitable for 75 years proved incorrect. Within weeks of the bombing, vegetation began reappearing in the ruins. Among the first plants to bloom again was the oleander, a resilient flowering shrub that the city later designated its official flower. In August 1949, the Japanese government passed the Hiroshima Peace Memorial City Construction Law, providing funding and public land for reconstruction. The architect Tanga Kenzo was commissioned to design a peace memorial park on the ground nearest the hypocenter. The park opened in 1950 and was expanded over subsequent decades. At its center stands the memorial cenotaph, a curved stone arch beneath which a stone chest holds the names of all identified victims of the bombing. Through the arch, along its sightline, stands the Genbaku Dome. The Genbaku Dome, the atomic bomb dome, is what remains of the Hiroshima Prefectural Industrial Promotion Hall, a three-story building with a copper-clad dome designed by the Czech architect Jan Letzel and completed in 1915. On August 6, 1945, the building stood approximately 160 meters from the point directly below the detonation. Because the explosion occurred almost directly overhead, the blast wave traveled nearly straight down through the structure's center. The outer walls and the steel frame of the dome partially resisted that near-vertical force. The interior was completely destroyed and everyone inside was killed, but the shell did not collapse. The building's future was debated for years. Many Hiroshima residents wanted it demolished. It was a ruin and a daily reminder of the worst event in the city's history. Others, particularly students and younger residents, argued for its preservation as a permanent record. In 1966, the Hiroshima City Council passed a resolution to preserve the building permanently. In 1996, the Genbaku Dome was added to the UNESCO World Heritage List, the only site inscribed as a memorial to nuclear warfare. It stands today in essentially the same condition as the autumn of 1945, its dome's steel frame open to the sky, preserved through periodic minimal stabilization work. Hiroshima today is a city of more than 1.2 million people, nearly 3.5 times the population present on August 6, 1945, when the population before the bomb was approximately 350,000. The rivers still run through it. The oleander still flowers along their banks. Each year on August 6th, at exactly 8:15 in the morning, bells ring across the city and a period of silence is observed. The Hiroshima Peace Memorial Ceremony draws attendees from around the world. The hibakusha, for as long as any remain, are given a place of honor. The inscription on the cenotaph, in place since 1952, reads, "Let all the souls here rest in peace, for we shall not repeat the evil." Barack Obama became the first sitting American president to visit Hiroshima in May 2016, standing before the cenotaph and bowing his head. He stated that the memory of the morning of August 6th must never fade. In May 2023, the leaders of the G7 visited the Peace Memorial Park together, walking through the museum. The Hiroshima Peace Memorial Museum receives more than 1.7 million visitors each year. Yoshito Matsushige, who took 2 photographs on the Miyuki Bridge and spent the rest of his career trying to answer the question of whether doing so had been right, died in 2005 at the age of 91. His photographs are preserved at the offices of the Chugoku Shimbun and in the permanent collection of the Hiroshima Peace Memorial Museum. They remain among the only photographs taken in Hiroshima within hours of the detonation, and the most direct visual record of what the bomb survivors looked like on August 6, 1945. The Soviet Union detonated its first atomic device in August 1949, 4 years after Hiroshima. The nuclear arms race that followed placed both superpowers in possession of hydrogen weapons far more powerful than Little Boy within a decade, weapons capable of destroying not a single city, but an entire region. The Cold War sustained a condition of nuclear readiness between the major powers for the next 4 decades. The doctrine of mutual assured destruction, the deterrent logic that no nuclear-armed state can attack another without assuring its own destruction, produced a form of stability that has persisted with its own attendant risks for 80 years since Hiroshima. The Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons opened for signature in 1968 and came into force in 1970. In 2017, the United Nations adopted the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, the first international agreement to comprehensively prohibit the development, production, stockpiling, and use of nuclear weapons. The Nobel Peace Prize that year was awarded to the international campaign to abolish nuclear weapons. At the award ceremony in Oslo in December 2017, Hibakusha Setsuko Thurlow, who had been 13 years old in Hiroshima on August 6, 1945, and had survived trapped under rubble, delivered the Nobel lecture. She described each of those killed as a person with a name, loved by someone, and said, "Let us ensure that their deaths were not in vain." As of March 2025, approximately 99,000 people remained registered as hibakusha with the Japanese government. Most are in their 80s or 90s. The number declines each year. The living memory of August 6, 1945 is passing from those who experienced it into the permanent record, into testimony, archive, and places like the Peace Memorial Park, which stands today where the center of Hiroshima stood before the bomb. And so, as the night settles in and you drift toward sleep, the story of Hiroshima rests where it belongs, in history, in memory, and in the weight of the facts themselves. A city on a river delta. A weapon loaded in darkness onto a silver aircraft. 43 seconds of falling. And then, 80 years of consequence that have not yet run their course. History of this kind does not resolve cleanly. It asks to be carried forward by those who witnessed it, by those who study it, and by those who simply take the time to listen. If tonight's story is one you'd like to return to, or if it led you somewhere useful in the quiet of the night, a like and a subscription to Price of Power mean a great deal and help these accounts reach more people. Sleep well. I'll see you next time. I'll see you next time. I'll see you next time. I'll see you next time.